You knit with great skill, madame. I am accustomed to it. A pretty pattern, too. You think so? Said madame, looking at him with a smile. Decidedly. May one ask what it is for? Pastime, said madame, still looking at him with a smile, while her fingers moved nimbly. Not for use? That depends. I may find use for it one day. If I do, well, said madame, drawing a breath and nodding her head with a stern kind of coquetry. I'll use it. Hi, hello, and welcome to part 2 of A Tale of Two Vests and Hats and Cities. Because the entirety of the video that I had planned became just a bit too unwieldy, just a bit too long, I've divided this into 2 parts. The first part has already been uploaded, where I discuss 4 kind of knitting projects. I talk about 2 vests that I worked on and 2 hats, and that video I will maybe magically link it on the screen if I can figure out how to do that. If not, it will definitely be linked in the description below. And thank you so much for coming back to part 2. In this part, me from the past will be talking about kind of intersections of knitting and the way that I'm thinking about knitting and Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities. So thanks again so much for joining me, and without further ado, here's the video. Now, usefulness, I think, is a good segue to talk about probably the most famous knitter in literature, but also some of my own anxieties about knitting as a hobby and some of the ways that knitting functions when we're kind of interacting with other people. So the knitter that I wanted to talk about, if you haven't guessed, is Madame Defarge of Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, and I was very pleased when I decided to use this 2 vest, 2 hat pun as an excuse to do a bit of a nerdy return for myself to A Tale of Two Cities, which I hadn't read in 15 years or something like that. I was very, very pleased to see that the copy that my local library has of A Tale of Two Cities is the Penguin Classics edition. These are nice cloth-bound editions, and this one has knitting on the front, as you can see. Which made me quite happy, and also I think indicates just how important knitting is, how integral knitting is to the plot of this novel. So, if you are not familiar with A Tale of Two Cities, this is the novel of Dickens's that gives us that very famous, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But that introduction is almost never quoted in full, so I will just read you, it's the whole first paragraph, but I'll read it quickly, just so you have it. So the book begins, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period, and like our present period too, I think, that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. So this is a book that's set during the French Revolution. If you're not familiar with it, the 2 cities in question are London and Paris, and there is a very English perspective in this novel, I think you could argue. Madame Defarge is a French revolutionary. She and her husband, Monsieur Defarge, who is very similar to her in political belief and identity, but is a much softer and less aggressive version of that character. The 2 of them together own a wine shop in central Paris and serve a varied clientele of local poor, but also some spy-type characters and other revolutionaries or opposition people who come through. And Madame Defarge is always knitting. She is famous for being one of the characters who is most frequently represented in her knitting, but also for the significance of what that knitting does, how it functions in the plot, both in ways I think that Dickens intended and, more interestingly, in ways that he didn't necessarily intend. So Madame Defarge historically falls within a recognized type, and a type that was in fact so recognized before Dickens wrote his novel, after Dickens wrote his novel, that they have a, formal, informal historical name. Madame Defarge is what we would have called a tricoteuse, which just means a female knitter. But as you can see from this extremely sensitive, shall we say, frontis illustration from an early serialized edition of A Tale of Two Cities, the tricoteuses, especially in England, were not very well regarded. The tricoteuses are sometimes also called the tricoteuses jacobin or the tricoteuses de Robespierre to more clearly delineate their political affiliation. And these women were famous for knitting all the time, but knitting specifically in front of the guillotine. And this is something that Madame Defarge definitely does, alongside her fellow tricoteuses. They set up chairs, or they occupy chairs that are set up in front of the guillotine so that the public can watch the executions, and they knit right through the executions. And in addition to their regular knitting, they would have been knitting, as I am, red hats, though mine is a coincidence because my father-in-law asked for a repeat of a red hat I knit him years ago, and theirs were specific symbols of the revolution, as you can see in various illustrations of the time. So these women were symbolically really entrenched in this revolutionary movement and in these kind of visible identifying markers of the revolution. Now, in the novel, knitting functions a little bit differently. Knitting functions in a very classic Victorian literature way to indicate kind of Madame Defarge tuning in and out of conversations, especially in her wine shop. She picks up her knitting when she's not interested, she puts it down when she is, and interestingly and specifically to Madame Defarge, you see her using her knitting as a bit of a veil so that she can pay attention without people necessarily thinking that that's what she's doing. In its more classic picking up the knitting to not pay attention, putting down the knitting to tune into a conversation sense, we see this all throughout Victorian literature. You see this a ton in Jane Austen, Edwardian literature. You see this a ton in Jane Austen, who doesn't technically qualify as a Victorian. You see this a ton in the Bronte sisters. You see this in many less famous, less quote-unquote canonical novels from the Victorian period. But Madame Defarge is quite unique in the way that she uses it to veil her attention, and also in the way that her knitting functions in a very particularly useful, and in the novel, sinister way. So Madame Defarge is definitely the most antagonistic character in the novel. I think that we could even call her the antagonist of the novel, and that is partly because she has a vendetta against the kind of protagonists of the novel, against the young ingenue lead female character of the novel and her family, which is something that we don't understand until later in the novel, and which I won't spoil for you. But she is also a lead antagonist of the novel because of the way that her knitting is functioning in a useful sense, because she is encoding information. She is essentially functioning as a spy, and she is encoding information about who the Reign of Terror should target into her knitting itself. And this is not legible to everyone else, but the kind of sinister, the sinister nature of her as a character and the sinister nature of her knitting is legible even if they don't understand. And I think that that is particularly legible in this section of the novel when Madame Defarge meets little Lucie, the kind of ingenue character, for the first time. And I'm just gonna, this is really quick, I'm just gonna read this to you really quickly. "Is that his child?" said Madame Defarge, stopping in her work for the first time and pointing her knitting needle at little Lucie as if it were the finger of fate. I think this works quite a bit better if you're using a straight knitting needle rather than the circular knitting needles that I usually use and have on hand. But I think that this is a really nice image for the way that it ties in the classical Greek fates and the way that thread often symbolized kind of lifelines, and the way that fiber arts are significant to our understanding of the fates in various ways. So there's a nice kind of overlaying of symbolic traditions there. But the way that she both puts her knitting down and then uses an accessory of the knitting as a kind of almost threatening go-between between her and little Lucy is very indicative of both what is happening in the novel and how the other characters are perceiving it. So this part, at least, is not historical. And as Loretta Napoleoni, who wrote a book called The Power of Knitting, talks about this particularly, how the Tricoteuses and the women who knit during the French Revolution are definitely representative of what we know historically, what historical documentation supports. But there is no evidence that they encoded any kind of information into their knitting that was at all relevant to the revolution. That is a fictionalization. That's Charles Dickens adding into the tradition. But Napoleon encourages us not to underestimate these women just because they were not participating in exactly the same way that Madame Defarge is. Because of course these women were a backbone of French society, they were supporting their families through their knitting, they were clothing their families through their knitting, and they were knitting in front of the guillotine, as Napoleon points out, because they were knitting all the time. Their knitting wasn't, their everyday knitting wasn't directly related to the revolution, their red hat knitting was, but they were knitting all the time because they were knitting all the time. Bring it to the guillotine because you're knitting as you walk around, you're knitting as you do everything. And these women were also absolutely politically engaged. Many historians link the kind of impetus or the start of the Reign of Terror to a march on Versailles that was led by women who were demanding that, the royal family provide bread to feed their families. So women in general were definitely significant to the Reign of Terror. Knitters were definitely significant to the Reign of Terror, and Madame Defarge represents those qualities really interestingly, I think. But my particular interest in her, and the part that I don't think that Dickens anticipated entirely, but which, at least for me, is there, is the way that part of what's threatening about Madame Defarge is the secrecy. It is that she has this private relationship with her knitting that the other characters can sense, but that they cannot understand. And I think that this is really interesting in a few different ways. I think it reveals the kind of anxiety that often accrues around anyone who does not fit the kind of what the central power of a given society wants people to look or think like, and has some kind of private, hobby is almost too casual a term in that context, isn't it? But the fact that she's knitting in the same way that, women often get called up on reading, and people are intrusive and want to know what you're reading or want to know what you're knitting. Part of that is just genuine curiosity and lovely and fine. But there's also, I'm sure that those of you who knit in public, there's a part of it that some people just want that not to be secret. They want to figure out what's happening here. What are you doing in a public space that is so private, that is so secretive and private to you? So I think that that's quite interesting. The other thing that I think I certainly take away from rereading Madame Defarge in my 30s now instead of in my teens when I first read A Tale of Two Cities is the function of usefulness itself. Of course, knitting, especially in this period, would have been very functional. There would not have been a lot of recreational knitting. Knitting would have been happening to clothe people and to earn money for families, and that's about it. Our knitting today can be a lot more recreational, but the spectrum of how we feel about that definitely differs, and the spectrum of how other people feel about that definitely differs. For myself, I feel more comfortable, for sure, when I'm spending time and money on hats that I'm going to wear a ton and things that are going to be useful and keep people that I love warm. But realistically, a huge part of the value of my knitting is the enjoyment that I take from it. And knitting something that I'm not going to end up wearing as much isn't necessarily a lost cause in the way that my anxiety can sometimes convince me that it is. And I think that for me, the kind of power that Madame Defarge and the kind of like grounding center that she gets from the knitting is a good reminder that, you know, usefulness is fine, but it doesn't always have to be the case that knitting produces something very useful. So those are some of the thoughts that came up for me in re-encountering the most famous knitter in literature written in English. I'm very interested in this kind of thing, so I might, you know, keep half an eye out for other instances of knitting as it crops up in literature. If this is something that interests you, please let me know, because I think that I will be going down a rabbit hole and I would love to have you come with me. Otherwise, I am going to finish up the hat for my father-in-law, and I probably won't show that again. I'll send that off, and I'm going to put all these other knits into rotation, and I hope that you have a good book on the go or a good knitting project, and I will talk to you next time. Thank you so much for joining me. Not for use? That depends. I may find use for it one day. If I do, well, said Madame, drawing a breath and nodding her head with a stern kind of coquetry, I'll use it.